What is happening, guys? It's Modded Warfare here. Welcome back to another PS5 and PS4 jailbreak news update. So it's been almost 2 months, or maybe over 2 months at this point, since my last update on this. And that's mainly because there's not been a whole lot of stuff that's come out. A few small things here or there, and I will cover them here in this video as well. But there has been something fairly significant that was just revealed yesterday, which is a new potential attack vector for the PS4 and PS5. We have a blog post here. This was brought to my attention here by Cturt. This blog post over here, hacking the PS4 and PS5 through the PS2 emulator. And this is part 1 of 2. We don't have part 2 released yet, as you can see, not found. So we're still waiting to find out about the second part of this whole exploit chain. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting one. Hacking the PS4 and PS5 through the built-in PlayStation 2 emulator. So a few things to note about this. Firstly, this is a userland exploit. So, just like with the Blu-ray drive exploit from the Flow, and, with the WebKit exploits we've had access to on the PS4 before, it is a userland exploit, but potentially it could maybe be chained with a kernel exploit in future if a kernel exploit is discovered for a higher firmware, and that could potentially turn this into a full chain exploit, which would be a full jailbreak for higher firmwares on the PS4. Although, of course, there is no kernel exploit that we currently know of on any of the higher firmwares for the PS4, so therefore we're not really talking about that at this stage. This is just focusing on the userland portion. However, it does seem to be a more powerful userland exploit than what we've seen in the past, for a number of different reasons that we'll go into. Another thing to note here is that this was reported back in September of 2021, so it's about a year old at this point, and it's only just been revealed now, and that is because Sony just approved it for disclosure. And what's weird about it is they approved it for disclosure, but it's not been patched, which means this vulnerability still exists up to the latest firmwares that the PS4 and PS5 are currently running, which at the time of recording, I believe is 6.00 on the PS5 and 10.00 on the PS4. So yeah, this vulnerability still works up to the latest firmwares, which is a bit weird why they haven't patched it, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So the reason why the PS2 emulator was chosen is because it contains what's known as JIT privileged code, or just-in-time privileged code, which Sony has been trying to disable, especially on the PS5 here. As you can see, Sony aggressively removed JIT privileged attack surface from PS5, disabled JIT in both the web browser and the Blu-ray player, and since the PS2 emulator is really a PS4 title that runs due to backwards compatibility, they were unable to make changes to the software, and so its JIT privilege had to be spared. So yeah, JIT privileged code is contained within the PS2 emulator. This seems to go against PlayStation's own security model, where they assume that, games, third-party games, are generally unsafe and therefore are ran in this sandboxed environment with JIT disabled. However, not with PS2 games. With PS2 games with the emulator, they've had to keep JIT privileged code in there in order to make the emulator work, I guess, and therefore it's exploitable. So in order to exploit this vulnerability, you start by exploiting a known bug in a PS2 game. In this case, it was Oak-Age Shadow King that was selected, mainly because it contains a known stack buffer overflow if you extend the player/town name. If you use a digital version, then you're tied to PSN in order to run that digital copy. So whenever there's a new firmware update, you would have to update the latest firmware to run that game. And so if they decided to patch it, then there wouldn't be anything you could really do. So to remove the PSN requirement, you want a PS2 game that has a vulnerability that's exploitable, but also is a disk version so that you don't have to use PSN to access the title. And using a modified save file, which you can just upload to the PS4 via a USB drive, the bug is then used to achieve code execution within the emulator. Once that's been achieved, other commands within the emulator are then exploited to gain access to the PS4's sort of native memory rather than just the sort of contained emulation portion. And then in its current state, the exploit can then be used to load other PS2 games and even PS2 homebrew that will function as if it's PS4 homebrew. So you can basically create PS4 homebrew, but it's technically a PS2 homebrew app because it's running within the emulator, the PS2 emulator, but it will have the same sort of functions as PS4 native homebrew. So yeah, that's essentially what this bug can do in its current state with this first part. And you can see that being demonstrated here with this video from Cturt. You can see we've got Oak-Age Shadow King is ran. And what happens when he actually loads up the game is he loads up the modified save file, which initiates the exploit. So he runs there, and then there you go, waiting to receive disk image. And he then sends a PlayStation 2 ISO over Wi-Fi to the PlayStation 4 to the file system so that they have another PS2 ISO on there. And then once that's been uploaded, which if we skip over here, you can see that's the percentage for uploading the PS2 ISO. And once it's been uploaded, it then boots that ISO. And now we're running another PS2 game. It was Orchid Shadow King, but it's now running a different title. And of course, this could also be used to load a PS4 homebrew that's technically a PS2 homebrew app that has PS4 homebrew functions. So you could have like a PS2 homebrew of PS4 Explorer that gives you access to the file system to move files around, just as an example. So one of the potential problems with loading the PS2 games with this method is that the emulator is going to be set up for the PS2 game. It's going to be pre-configured for the PS2 game that you're currently running, the main PS2 game that's loading the exploit. Therefore, any other PS2 games that you sideload might have compatibility issues because the emulator is not pre-configured for that particular game that you're sideloading. So therefore, you know, there are more chances of running into more bugs when loading other PS2 games with this method. So that's what part 1's capable of. Now, the second part of this exploit chain, the intention is to get access to, you know, proper full arbitrary code execution for a more practical homebrew environment, which essentially means the ability to run native PS4 homebrew apps like the current homebrew apps that we currently use on our jailbroken PS4s. There's that. And then there's also, of course, maybe the possibility of running actual PS4 games as well through this method, again without a kernel exploit, just as the userland exploit, although this is something that the Flow also thought was possible with his exploit with the Blu-ray drive one. However, there wasn't enough memory in the BDJ stack in order to allow for running PS4 games. I'm not sure if there's going to be a similar limitation here. Perhaps there will be, in which case we won't be able to run PS4 games, but it's also something that might be on the cards at this stage. With part 2. But with part 1, we can run other PS2 games and also run PS2 homebrew that functions as PS4 homebrew. But again, part 2, possibly PS4 games and certainly PS4 homebrew may be able to run with the full exploits once we have part 2. So of course the question is, why have they not bothered to try and patch this vulnerability? Because of course this was initially reported a year ago, and Sony has now allowed it to be disclosed without actually patching the bug in any of the firmware versions. So, you know, why would they do that? Well, CTURT has said that this is unpatchable, and he doesn't mean it's completely unpatchable. It's not impossible for it to be patched. However, it just seems to be highly impractical for Sony to try and actually patch this for a number of different reasons, mainly because the fact that they've kind of violated their own security model by implementing something that has this privileged code and with no way to actually, you know, patch it out. Because of course they could release like an update perhaps for the PS2 games where you just download the update and it patches it. But then of course you could just remove the update and run the game offline and you would still be able to access the vulnerability. They could try and disable the JIT privileged code in the emulator, and so any new versions of the emulator that they release for newer PS2 games that they're releasing would be patched, but then you could still run the older versions. If they patched it in a firmware update so that it would disable the JIT privileged code in the older PS2 games, then those PS2 games wouldn't function offline, which obviously is an expectation that consumers have, that they should be able to run their discs offline, especially if it's not an online only title, it's a PS2 game. So they expect to be able to run it without having to download like a day one patch from the internet. So yeah, it's possible for them to patch it, but it's very impractical for them to do so. So that's all I really have here for this particular exploit. Of course, we're waiting for part 2, and we're also, you know, waiting for some kind of implementation that we can test this on. All we really need is the save file that's used for this PS2 game, as well as a copy of the PS2 game if you have it, and then you could try this out yourself. But yeah, we'll wait to see if we get an implementation from someone. And of course, we're waiting for part 2 to be revealed at some point in the future. So in terms of the Blu-ray drive exploit, the BDJ exploit, since my last update over 2 months ago, there has been a few small developments. One of them from Slayer's Gorvy, who added code for truly arbitrary function call. So the POC now lists the root directory, which is not possible from Java. So before, he was using Java to get access to like the app0 directory, and there was also the ability to get the sandbox directory. However, now he has access to the root directory of the file system, so essentially all the files on the PS5's hard drive. However, there's no way to upload files to the PS5's hard drive at the moment, or even dump them to the computer at this stage, not the root directory anyway. So that's what we have from Slayer's Gorvy. We also have, of course, John Tornblum, who's released some more samples, including a sample that will allow you to run a Lua server on the PS5. So you can burn the ISO to a disk, pop it in the PS5, and it will run a Lua server, and you can then send Lua scripts over the network to execute them on the PS5, which is pretty cool. So there's a few sample scripts that you can run. I'll leave them down in the video description. There's one that will allow you to print out a notification on screen, which is pretty cool. And then there's also one that will give you your Java version, the current version of Java that's running on the PS5. And there's another Lua script that will redirect the kernel log to your computer over the network. So you can actually get the kernel log output to your computer, just like on the PS4, except the PS4 kernel log is encrypted and it requires like a payload to decrypt. Whereas the PS5 one does not appear to be encrypted, so you can just get the raw data straight from the kernel log outputted to your computer, which is pretty cool. So those are kind of the updates over the past couple of months in terms of the BDJ exploit. Unfortunately, nothing more significant than that at this stage. So I guess it's really the PS2 emulator exploit that seems to be the hot stuff at the moment. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this update or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one.